Between 1933 and 1945, American kitchens stretched 30 meals under $1 using Betty Crocker's wartime guide and Depression-era survival recipes. Half are impossible to make today, not because ingredients vanished, but because we stopped saving bacon drippings and eating yesterday's bread as tonight's dinner. Number 3 is a 6-cent bowl that lulled kids to sleep. Number 7 got grandmothers banned from church suppers for serving roadside weeds. And Number 19 fed 15 people at a funeral on 20 cents. Hit subscribe because Number 8 has a name women whispered at potlucks, and it fed 6 people for 19 cents. Opened the pound of ground beef on a Wednesday in 1943 and stared at the Wheaties box because the recipe said to shape it like a T-bone. Real steak was sailing to Europe on troop ships out of Austin, Minnesota, where Hormel canned 90% of the pork the Army would eat. Your husband's ration book had 8 red stamps left, and a pound of sirloin cost 12. Ground beef cost 3. You kneaded a cup of crushed Wheaties into the meat with milk, onion, salt, pepper, then formed it into the shape of the steak you remembered and broiled it 8 minutes per side. The table was silent when your daughter asked if it was steak. You said close enough. The Wheaties soaked up every drop of grease the beef tried to release, so it sat heavy and gray, holding on to fat the way your ration book held on to those last stamps. You browned the pound of ground beef with 2 tablespoons of minced onion in the same skillet your mother used during the First War. Betty Crocker called it Scotch scallops in her 1950 cookbook and featured it in a radio series called Menace of Allied Nations, though nobody in Scotland had ever heard of it. The name didn't matter when your husband's paycheck came on Friday and the grocery money ran out on Tuesday. You stirred in a half cup of milk, salt, pepper, covered the pan and let it simmer 15 minutes while you boiled potatoes. The beef went onto a platter surrounded by mashed potatoes that hid how little meat there was. Your son scraped his plate clean and asked what country it came from. You told him the country of making do. This is number 3 from the intro, the 6-cent bowl that lulled more kids to sleep than any bedtime story. You boiled 3 cups of water in the saucepan at 6 in the morning because the children would be awake soon, and there was nothing else. 1 cup of yellow cornmeal, fine as you could get, stirred into the boiling water with a teaspoon of salt until it thickened into something that would stick to their ribs. Your grandmother made it in 1934, when the bank took the farm and called it mush, because porridge sounded like something people with money ate. You poured it into bowls and the kitchen went quiet. It put more kids to sleep that year than any lullaby, because a full belly was the only bedtime story that worked. The next morning you sliced what was left, fried it in butter until the outside crisped, and served it with syrup for breakfast.
Many of you have been asking where to find these recipes. We've gathered hundreds of them from the Depression era through the 1970s in our cookbook, Grandma's Kitchen. Complete instructions, pro tips in 10 chapters. Link is in the description below. Now, let's get back to the video.
You toasted 2 slices of bread in the oven because your daughter woke up with a fever and couldn't keep anything down. Milk toast was what your mother made when you were sick in 1918, and it was what the cookbook said to make when a child needed something gentle. You heated a cup of whole milk in the small saucepan until it steamed, tore the buttered toast into pieces, dropped them into a shallow bowl, and poured the hot milk over. A pinch of salt, a sprinkle of sugar and cinnamon because she was 7 and frightened. She ate 3 bites and fell asleep before the bowl was empty. The doctor came on Tuesday and said it was just a cold. By Thursday, she asked for milk toast again, even though she wasn't sick anymore. 14 cents bought the softest meal you ever made, and she still asks for it 40 years later. Mix the batter without eggs, because the hens weren't laying and the ration board hadn't issued egg coupons in 2 weeks. Betty Crocker printed the recipe on a card in 1943 and called them Victory Pancakes. Though there was nothing victorious about flour, baking powder, salt, and milk mixed into something that wouldn't rise. You poured the batter onto the griddle, and they cooked flat and dense, nothing like the pancakes your husband remembered from before. He ate 4 without complaint, because complaining was something people did when they had choices. Your son drowned his in syrup and asked if the war was almost over. You said soon, but it would be 2 more years before eggs came back, and pancakes looked right again. 14 cents worth of flour and milk kept the table from being empty, and that was the only victory that mattered on a Thursday morning in February. 8 cups of diced potatoes went into the pot on a Tuesday in 1938 because your father asked for cellar soup and winter was 3 months from ending. He grew up in Saskatchewan, one of 12 children, and called it cellar soup because the potatoes came from the root cellar, where they'd been stored since October. The onion cooked in butter until it turned soft. Then the potatoes and grated carrot went in, covered with water just above the vegetables, simmering for 45 minutes. Your father stood by the stove and waited. When it finished, you mashed half the soup to thicken it the way his mother did, and he ate 2 bowls without speaking. 25 cents worth of potatoes and vegetables from the cellar fed a family of 6. Remember number 7? The dish that got grandmothers banned from church suppers for serving livestock feed? This is it. The women at the church turned their backs when you said you brought dandelion salad. One of them said, "Ladies don't serve weeds." This was Saturday afternoon in 1936, and you walked home with a paring knife in your pocket because dandelions grew along the roadside, and your mother taught you how to cut them at the root. Your grandmother foraged dandelions during the First War and called them free vitamins, loaded with iron and calcium, more nutritious than anything you could buy. The greens were soaked in cold water to remove the dirt, then you tossed them with 2 tablespoons of bacon drippings and a splash of vinegar. 7 cents for the bacon fat because the greens cost nothing. This is number 8, the meal with a name women whispered at potlucks, the one that fed 6 people for 19 cents. The can of salmon sat on the counter with 19 cents marked on the label in pencil because the grocer knew everyone was counting. Thursday afternoon in 1942, and you opened it with the church key, picking through for bones because you couldn't waste a single piece. Salmon wiggle was what your mother called creamed salmon over toast, a depression dish that lingered into the war, years when fresh fish disappeared. Rehook, but wait until you see what number 15 does with a nickel's worth of oats and water. Tuesday morning in 1935, and you mixed 1 cup of cornmeal with a half cup of flour, a pinch of salt, a tablespoon of sugar, and enough boiling water to make a thick batter that held its shape when you spooned it onto the griddle. Johnny cakes were what your grandmother called them in Rhode Island, though people in the South called them journey cakes, because you could carry them in your pocket when you worked in the fields, and they wouldn't spoil in the heat. The griddle heated with a little bacon grease, and you dropped the batter in rounds the size of your palm, flipping them once when the edges browned and the centers bubbled. They came out flat and dense, not fluffy like regular pancakes, and you served them with molasses or butter if you had any. Glazed Turnip Peas turnips cost 4 cents a pound, and nobody wanted them because they were bitter and reminded people of hard times. Wednesday afternoon in 1944, and the Canadian recipe card said they'd taste sweet if you glazed them right. Your mother said bitterness was just a lack of sugar and patience. They simmered until the liquid turned into a shiny glaze that clung to every piece. Thursday evening in 1937, and you stood at the counter with 2 boiled potatoes, 1 boiled beet, half an onion, and a few scraps of corned beef left over from Sunday dinner that you'd been saving in the icebox wrapped in wax paper. Red flannel hash was what the New England cooks called it, because the beet turned everything pink, and your mother made it during the First War when meat was scarce and leftovers were stretched as far as they could go. You diced the potatoes and beet into small cubes, chopped the onion fine, shredded the corned beef with your fingers, 'cause there wasn't enough to slice, then fried everything together in 2 tablespoons of bacon grease in the cast iron skillet your grandmother gave you when you got married. The beet bled its color into the potatoes, and the whole pan turned a deep rose color that looked strange, but tasted better than it looked, savory and sweet at the same time, with the salt from the corned beef and the fat from the bacon holding it all together. You fried it until the bottom crisped and browned, then flipped it in sections and let the other side crisp too. Your husband ate 2 helpings and said it reminded him of his grandmother's kitchen in Boston. Your children picked at the beets, but ate the potatoes and corned beef without fuss. 38 cents for potatoes, beet, onion, and leftover corned beef fed a family of 6 and used up everything in the icebox that would have spoiled by morning. A head of cabbage cost 8 cents in 1937 and would feed a family for 2 days if you made it into soup. Wednesday afternoon, and you chopped the cabbage into rough pieces, diced 2 potatoes, sliced a sweet onion, and dropped everything into the largest pot you owned with 6 cups of water and a tablespoon of butter, because butter was cheaper than meat and gave the soup a richness that made it taste like you'd tried. Your mother made cabbage soup every week during the Depression and called it stretching soup because you could add anything you had on hand. Carrots if the grocer had them cheap, celery if your neighbor's garden had extra, a handful of rice or barley if the pantry was low and payday was still 4 days out. It simmered for an hour until the cabbage turned soft and the potatoes broke apart and thickened the broth, and the whole kitchen smelled like something better than it was. Your son came home from school and asked what was for dinner. You said cabbage soup, and he didn't complain, because complaining meant he was ungrateful, and ungrateful children didn't eat twice. 22 cents for cabbage, potatoes, onion, and butter made 8 bowls of soup that filled bellies, even if it didn't fill dreams. And your husband scraped his bowl clean and said it was good enough. Good enough was the best compliment a soup could get in 1937, and you'd take it. Monday afternoon in 1932, and you opened a can of pork and beans and dumped it into the pot with 3 hot dogs sliced into rounds, half an onion diced small, and 2 cans of stewed tomatoes, because tomatoes were cheap and filled the pot and made it look like more than it was. They called it Hoover stew during the Depression, because President Hoover promised prosperity but delivered bread lines instead, and naming a poverty meal after him was the only revenge people had left when voting didn't change anything. Your husband came home from looking for work and said there wasn't any. Not today, not this week, maybe not this month, and you stirred the stew and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that hadn't already been said 100 times before. The stew simmered 20 minutes until the onions turned soft and the hot dogs plumped up and gave their salt and fat to the beans and tomatoes, and the whole pot smelled better than it had any right to, considering it cost 35 cents and contained nothing fresh or expensive or worth bragging about. You ladled it into bowls and served it with day-old bread from the bakery markdown bin, and your children ate without asking what was in it because asking meant you weren't grateful for what you had. Your husband scraped his bowl clean and said it was good enough, and good enough was the best you could hope for in 1932, when men who used to wear suits now stood in line for soup that wasn't as good as this. Clara Canucciari made this dish famous on YouTube in 2007 when she was 91 years old and wanted to teach people how her family survived the Depression. Potatoes, onions, and hot dogs fried in a skillet with salt and pepper. That was the whole recipe. Thursday evening in 1934, and you peeled 4 potatoes, sliced them thin, chopped an onion, cut 3 hot dogs into rounds, and fried everything in 2 tablespoons of oil until the potatoes crisped at the edges and the onions turned golden, and the hot dogs gave up their salt and fat into the pan. It smelled better than it had any right to, and your children ate without talking, because talking at the table meant you weren't hungry enough. Clara said on her video that poor man's meal was what they ate when payday was far away and the pantry was nearly empty. And she laughed when she said it, because 80 years later it was funny, but in 1934 it wasn't funny at all. Your husband worked 6 days a week and brought home $11, and 4 of that went to rent, and 2 went to coal, and the rest went to food, and 47 cents worth of potatoes, onions, and hot dogs, stretched across 2 dinners if you served it with bread. Clara's grandson filmed her making it in her kitchen in 2007, and millions of people watched and said they remembered when their grandmothers made the same thing. You never forgot. The recipe was numbered 99 in a wartime pamphlet and cost less than 20 cents to make 4 bowls. Friday morning in 1942, and you melted a tablespoon of margarine in a saucepan, added 2 finely chopped onions, and fried them 5 minutes until they turned translucent and sweet. 3 tablespoons of porridge oats went in next, then a pint of water, salt, pepper, and whatever dried herbs were left in the tin from last summer's garden. It simmered 20 minutes while you stirred, and the oats absorbed the water and turned the soup thick and creamy without a drop of cream. Then you added 3 grated carrots and half a pint of milk and let it simmer another 15 minutes until the carrots softened and the kitchen smelled like something wholesome. Your mother-in-law visited and said oatmeal belonged in a bowl for breakfast, not in soup for dinner, and you said oatmeal belonged wherever it filled a stomach for under $1. She didn't argue. The soup was surprisingly good, nutty from the oats, sweet from the carrots, rich from the milk, and you served it with homemade croutons cut from stale bread because bread never went to waste, and waste was a sin when people were dying overseas. 20 cents fed 4 people and left enough for lunch the next day, and your husband said it tasted better than anything his mother ever made, and you didn't correct him. Navy bean soup, your grandmother called it depression bean soup, because that's when she learned to make it. 1 pound of dried navy beans and a ham bone left over from Sunday dinner boiled into something that fed 12 people for 2 days. Monday afternoon in 1936, and you soaked the beans overnight, drained them, dropped them into a pot with the ham bone, a chopped onion, 3 carrots, 2 celery stalks, and enough water to cover everything by 2 inches. It simmered 3 hours on low heat while you did laundry and mended socks and checked the pot every 30 minutes to skim the foam and stir the bottom so nothing stuck and burned. The beans broke apart and thickened the broth, and the ham bone gave up every scrap of meat and flavor it had left, and by the time your husband came home, the soup was thick enough to hold a spoon upright. He ate 2 bowls and said it was better than the roast that made the bone in the first place. Your children sopped up the broth with day-old bread and asked for more. 40 cents for a pound of beans and vegetables made enough soup to fill a family twice, and you froze half for the week after next, when money would be tighter and the icebox would be emptier. Your grandmother said navy bean soup was proof that poor people ate better than rich people because rich people threw the ham bone away. You saved every bone after that. 2 eggs and 3 cups of chicken stock made a soup that tasted like you'd spent an hour cooking when you'd really spent 10 minutes standing at the stove. Tuesday evening in 1941, and you cracked 2 eggs into a bowl, beat them until the yolks and whites mixed smooth, then brought the stock to a simmer and poured the eggs in a thin stream while stirring with a fork so they formed delicate ribbons instead of scrambled chunks. A pinch of salt, a crack of pepper, a splash of soy sauce if you had it from the Chinese grocer on the corner, who sold it for 5 cents a bottle and made it last 6 months. The soup finished in 3 minutes, and you ladled it into bowls and served it with saltine crackers, because crackers made any soup feel like a meal. Your mother said egg drop soup was Chinese, and your grandmother said egg drop soup was poor, but your family ate it 3 times a month because eggs were cheap and stock was free if you saved the bones from Sunday chicken and boiled them Monday morning with onion scraps and carrot tops. 25 cents for 2 eggs and a few crackers fed 4 people and left them warm and full, and your daughter said it tasted like the restaurant downtown, where you used to go before the Depression, but couldn't afford anymore. You didn't tell her it wasn't the same. You let her remember it however she wanted. 10 ounces of stale bread sat on the counter for 3 days because nobody wanted to eat it dry, and you couldn't throw it away when people were starving and bread cost 8 cents a loaf. Wednesday afternoon in 1943, and you tore the bread into chunks, soaked it in a bowl of water until it turned soft, squeezed out the water, and mashed it with a fork until it looked like wet porridge. 2 ounces of margarine melted in your hands as you worked it into the bread with an ounce of sugar, 2 ounces of raisins, a pinch of salt, and enough milk to make it hold together when you pressed it into a baking dish. It went into the oven at 350 for an hour, and came out dense and heavy, not fluffy like a cake, but sweet enough to call dessert. Your children ate it warm with a spoonful of custard made from powdered eggs and milk, and your husband ate it cold the next morning with his tea, because bread pudding kept for days, and tasted better the second day anyway. 35 cents for stale bread, margarine, sugar, and raisins made 8 servings of something that felt like abundance even though it was born from scraps, and your mother said bread pudding was proof that nothing was ever truly wasted if you knew what to do with it. You made bread pudding every week after that until the bread wasn't stale anymore and you didn't need to. This is number 19, the 20-cent pot that fed 15 people at a funeral, and the pastor came back for thirds. Clara made this dish on her YouTube channel and said it fed 15 people at her family's table during the Depression, when 15 people showing up for dinner was normal and turning someone away was unthinkable. Sunday afternoon in 1933, and you boiled a pound of elbow macaroni in a pot with 2 cans of peas, including the liquid from the cans, because that liquid was salty and sweet and counted as flavor when flavor was expensive. You fried a diced onion in 2 tablespoons of oil, added the cooked pasta and peas, stirred everything together with salt and pepper, and served it in the largest bowl you owned, because 15 people meant cousins and neighbors, and the man from down the street whose wife left, and who didn't know how to cook. It cost 20 cents to make, and nobody left hungry. Your uncle, who was a pastor at the church on 5th Street, ate 2 servings and asked if you could make it again next Sunday, and you did, and the Sunday after that, and for 6 months straight until the economies and people found work. And 15 people at the table became 8, and then 5, and then just your family again. 20 cents for pasta, peas, onion, and oil bought more than a meal. It bought proof that generosity didn't require wealth and that feeding people mattered more than feeding them well. Clara said that on her video 70 years later, and when she said it, she smiled, and you understood why. Split peas cost 10 cents a pound in 1942 and made soup thick enough to stand a spoon in when you simmered them long enough and didn't rush. Sunday afternoon, and you poured 8 ounces of dried green peas into a pot with 2 chopped onions, 2 carrots, a parsnip, a white potato, and a pint of water. Then let it bubble gently on the back of the stove for 2 hours, while you did the washing and ironed your husband's work shirts, and listened to the radio broadcast news from overseas. The peas broke down and thickened the broth and turned it creamy without cream, because cream was rationed, and cream was for special occasions. And Sunday soup wasn't special, it was just necessary. Your mother made split pea soup during the First War and said it was peasant food, the kind of thing farmers ate when they couldn't afford meat. But your mother also said peasant food kept people alive when fancy food ran out, so you made it anyway and didn't apologize. The ham bone from last week's dinner went into the pot if you had one, or a teaspoon of salt and a bay leaf if you didn't. And the soup finished when the peas dissolved into the liquid and the vegetables turned soft, enough to mash with the back of a spoon. Your children ate it with thick slices of bread, and your husband said it tasted better than anything he'd eaten all week, which wasn't a compliment, because the week had been lean and the meals had been spare, but you took it anyway, because split pea soup was honest food, and honest food didn't lie about what it was. 25 cents for peas, vegetables, and a ham bone made 8 bowls of soup that filled stomachs and stuck to ribs and lasted 2 days if you stretched it. And your grandmother said split pea soup was proof that the best meals came from the humblest ingredients if you knew how to treat them right. You served it 3 times a month for the next 4 years, until the war ended and meat came back, and people stopped wanting soup that reminded them of rationing and hardship, but you never stopped making it because split pea soup was more than food. It was a memory of making do and getting through, and feeding a family when feeding a family was the hardest job you'd ever done. Flour gravy was what you made when there wasn't anything else, and breakfast had to happen anyway, because children couldn't go to school on empty stomachs, and empty stomachs made teachers ask questions you didn't want to answer. Monday morning in 1933, and you melted 2 tablespoons of butter in a skillet, stirred in 2 tablespoons of flour until it made a paste that bubbled and turned golden, then poured in a cup of milk slowly while whisking so it wouldn't clump up and turn into something you'd have to throw away, because throwing away food was a sin and wasting milk was worse. The gravy thickened in 3 minutes, and you added salt and pepper and poured it over 4 slices of toasted bread, because toast made anything feel like a meal, and a meal meant you'd done your job as a mother, even when your job felt impossible. Your children ate without complaining, because complaining meant they were ungrateful, and ungrateful children didn't deserve what little there was. And your husband drank his coffee black and said nothing, because there was nothing to say about flour gravy, except that it filled the gap between hunger and the next meal. Some families cracked an egg into the gravy and called it egg gravy, stretching it further and adding protein when protein was scarce. But you didn't have eggs that week, so you made do with what was in the cupboard. And what was in the cupboard was flour and milk and butter and bread. 15 cents for butter, flour, milk, and bread made breakfast for 4, and got everyone out the door without fainting from hunger, which was the measure of success during the Depression. Not whether the food was good, but whether it kept people standing. Your mother made flour gravy during the First War and said it was poor people's food, the kind of thing you ate when you couldn't afford bacon or sausage or ham. But your mother also said poor people's food was honest food, and honest food never pretended to be something it wasn't. You made flour gravy 3 times a week for 2 years, until your husband found steadier work, and the paycheck came regularly, and you could afford oatmeal and eggs again. But you never forgot how to make it, because forgetting how to make flour gravy meant forgetting how close you'd come to having nothing at all. Wait until you see what number 28 does with a quarter's worth of flour and yeast. The Italians called it pasta fazool and ate it when money was tight, and beans were cheaper than meat, and pasta was cheaper than everything. Monday evening in 1935, and you soaked a cup of white beans overnight, boiled them until they turned soft, then fried a diced onion and 2 cloves of garlic in olive oil until the kitchen smelled like your grandmother's house in Naples before she came to America. A can of crushed tomatoes went into the pot with the beans, a cup of the bean water, salt, pepper, a pinch of dried oregano from the jar your mother brought from the old country, and half a pound of ditalini pasta, added when the soup was nearly done, because the pasta had to cook in the broth to taste right. It finished in 30 minutes, and you served it with a crust of bread to soak up the liquid at the bottom of the bowl. Because liquid at the bottom meant you wasted food, and wasting food meant you'd forgotten where you came from. Your husband's paycheck was late again, and the rent was due on Friday, and 30 cents worth of beans, pasta, tomatoes, and garlic made enough soup to stretch across 3 dinners if you served smaller portions and didn't offer seconds. Your children didn't complain. Dean Martin's mother made the same soup in Ohio, and he grew up singing about it, and 70 years later, people still made it, because pasta e fagioli was proof that being poor and being Italian were the same thing during the Depression, and neither one was easy. The grocer threw the beet greens into the compost bin behind the store because customers wanted the beets and didn't know what to do with the greens, but you knew what to do with them because your grandmother taught you that the greens were more nutritious than the roots, and wasting the greens meant you didn't understand vegetables. Wednesday afternoon in 1935, and you asked the grocer if you could have the greens he was throwing away, and he looked at you like you were poor, which you were. But being poor didn't mean being ashamed, so you took the greens home and washed them 3 times to get the dirt out. Because beets grew in the ground and the dirt clung to the leaves, and eating dirt was something even poor people didn't have to do. The greens cost nothing, because the grocer was going to throw them away anyway, but you bought a nickel's worth of bacon ends from the butcher, because bacon ends were the scraps left over after he cut the good bacon, and scraps were cheap, and bacon fat made anything taste better. You chopped the greens, fried the bacon ends until the fat rendered out and the pieces crisped, then wilted the greens in the bacon fat with a splash of vinegar and a pinch of salt. They cooked down to almost nothing, a whole armful of greens reducing to a single serving when the water cooked out, but that single serving was packed with iron and vitamins and flavor that tasted like you'd put effort in, even though effort was just knowing how to use what other people threw away. Your children wrinkled their noses and said the greens tasted like dirt, and you said dirt tastes like health, so eat them anyway, and they did, because children who refused food didn't get offered food twice. 5 cents for bacon ends and free greens from the compost bin made a side dish that stretched across 2 dinners if you served small portions, and your grandmother said beet greens were proof that rich people were fools who paid for roots and threw away the best part, and you agreed because you'd been eating the best part for free, while rich people paid for the worst part and called it a vegetable. Beet greens became your secret, the thing you served when money was tight and the garden was empty and the grocer's compost bin was full, and nobody ever knew you were eating trash, because trash, when cooked right, tasted better than anything you could buy. leftover mashed potatoes sat in the icebox for 3 days because nobody wanted to eat them cold, and reheating them made them gummy and unappetizing. But throwing them away meant you'd wasted food, and wasting food during wartime was unpatriotic, and unpatriotic meant you didn't understand what soldiers were dying for overseas. Thursday morning in 1944, and you scooped 2 cups of cold mashed potatoes into a bowl, the potatoes stiff and dry from sitting uncovered on the top shelf, where condensation couldn't reach them. Then cracked an egg into them, added a 1/4 cup of flour, a handful of shredded cheese if you had it, which you usually didn't, salt, pepper, and mixed everything with your hands until it held together when you pressed it into a patty and didn't fall apart when you tried to lift it. The skillet heated with a tablespoon of butter, and you fried the patties 3 minutes per side until they crisped and browned and smelled like something you'd planned instead of something you'd improvised from leftovers that were on the edge of going bad. Your children ate them with applesauce, and your husband ate them with sour cream, and you ate them plain, because there wasn't enough applesauce or sour cream for everyone, and mothers ate last.
Yeah.
When portions were small and eating last meant sometimes not eating at all. Potato pancakes were German, or Polish, or Jewish, depending on who you asked. But during the Depression and the war, they were just practical, a way to use up leftovers and turn them into breakfast or dinner or lunch. When lunch was whatever you could fry in a pan and serve hot and convince people was a real meal. Your mother-in-law made potato pancakes from raw potatoes, grating them by hand until her knuckles bled and mixing them with onion and egg and frying them in schmaltz that she saved from rendering chicken fat. But you didn't have time for grating or schmaltz, so you used what was already cooked and called it good enough, because good enough was all anyone could ask for when the war was still going and rationing was still tight. 20 cents for potatoes, an egg, flour, and butter made 8 pancakes that fed a family and used up leftovers that would have gone to waste if you hadn't known what to do with them. And your grandmother said potato pancakes were proof that the best cooks were the ones who never threw anything away, because creativity came from scarcity, and scarcity taught you to see potential in things other people considered garbage. You made potato pancakes every week for the rest of your life, even after the war ended and food was plentiful and nobody cared about leftovers anymore, because potato pancakes reminded you of a time when nothing was wasted and everything mattered, and a cold lump of mashed potatoes could become breakfast if you knew what to do with it. And knowing what to do with it was the difference between surviving and surrendering. Lentils were the cheapest protein you could buy in 1936. Cheaper than beans, cheaper than eggs, cheaper than the toughest cut of meat the butcher had left at closing time on Saturday. A pound of brown lentils cost 12 cents and made soup for a week if you planned it right and didn't let anyone take seconds until the pot was nearly empty. Tuesday evening, and you sorted through the lentils on the kitchen table, picking out the stones and the broken ones, then rinsed them and dropped them into a pot with a diced onion, 2 chopped carrots, a celery stalk, 4 cups of water, and a bay leaf from the jar your mother gave you when you got married. The soup simmered an hour, and the lentils softened but didn't dissolve, holding their shape the way good lentils did when you didn't overcook them, and the broth turned golden and rich, even though there wasn't a drop of fat in the pot. Your grandmother made lentil soup in Italy before she came to America, and called it zuppa di lenticchie, and she said lentils were peasant food. But peasants lived longer than kings because peasants ate food that worked instead of food that impressed. You added a splash of vinegar at the end, because vinegar brightened the flavor and made the soup taste like you'd put more effort in than you had, then served it with day-old bread fried in a little oil until it crisped and turned into something that felt like abundance. Your husband came home from the factory and ate 2 bowls without talking, because talking at dinner meant you weren't hungry enough, and your children sopped up the broth and asked if there was more. And the broth turned golden and rich, even though there wasn't a drop of fat in the pot. Your grandmother made lentil soup in Italy before she came to America, and called it zuppa di lenticchie, and she said lentils were peasant food. But peasants lived longer than kings because peasants ate food that worked instead of food that impressed. You added a splash of vinegar at the end, because vinegar brightened the flavor and made the soup taste like you'd put more effort in than you had, then served it with day-old bread fried in a little oil until it crisped and turned into something that felt like abundance. Your husband came home from the factory and ate 2 bowls without talking, because talking at dinner meant you weren't hungry enough, and your children sopped up the broth and asked if there was more. You said maybe tomorrow. 25 cents for lentils, vegetables, and bread made enough soup to feed a family twice, and leave a jar in the icebox for lunch the next day, and the soup tasted better the second day anyway, because lentils absorbed flavor overnight and turned into something better than they were the first time around. Your mother said lentil soup was proof that poverty didn't mean hunger if you knew how to cook, and you believed her because you'd never gone to bed hungry, even when the money ran out and the cupboard was bare, and lentil soup was the reason why. 12 hard-boiled eggs sat in a bowl on the counter because the hens were laying again after a long winter, and you had more eggs than you knew what to do with, which was a problem rich people had. But during the Depression felt like a blessing you didn't question. Friday evening in 1938, and you peeled the eggs one by one, the shells sticking to the whites because fresh eggs never peeled clean, then chopped them into rough chunks and set them aside while you made the white sauce that would turn simple eggs into something that felt like a real meal. A quarter cup of butter melted in the saucepan, and you whisked in a half cup of flour until it bubbled and turned golden. Then added 3 cups of milk slowly, stirring constantly so it wouldn't lump and turn into something you'd have to throw away. Because throwing away a white sauce meant wasting butter and flour and milk, and wasting 3 ingredients at once was a sin you couldn't afford to commit. The sauce thickened in 5 minutes, and you added the chopped eggs, a tablespoon of chicken bouillon that you crumbled between your fingers, salt, pepper, and poured the whole thing over 6 slices of toasted bread, because toast was the foundation of half the meals you made during hard times, and toast never failed you. Your mother called creamed eggs on toast church supper food, the kind of thing women brought to potlucks when they didn't have money for ham or roast beef, but needed to feed 20 people and look generous. Doing it, and your mother was right, because creamed eggs stretched further than any other dish you knew, and still tasted like you'd put effort in. Your children ate it without complaining, and your husband said it reminded him of his grandmother's cooking, which was a compliment even though his grandmother was a terrible cook who boiled everything until it turned gray and flavorless. 45 cents for eggs, butter, flour, milk, and bread fed 6 people and left enough for lunch the next day, which you served cold, because creamed eggs tasted good cold, and reheating them made the sauce separate and turned greasy and unappetizing. Your neighbor said creamed eggs on toast was poor people's food, and you said poor people's food was the only food that mattered because rich people's food didn't teach you anything about survival or creativity or making do with what you had, and she stopped talking to you after that. But you didn't care, because she'd never gone hungry, and people who'd never gone hungry didn't understand that creamed eggs on toast wasn't about the eggs. It was about the sauce and the toast, and the fact that you could feed a family for under 50 cents. and still have them leave the table full and grateful and asking when you'd make it again. Leftover vegetables lived in the icebox in mismatched containers because you saved everything and nothing went to waste. Not the 3 spoonfuls of mashed potatoes from Tuesday, or the half-cup of cooked carrots from Wednesday, or the handful of peas from Thursday. That nobody wanted to eat because cold peas tasted like punishment. Saturday afternoon in 1943, and you gathered all the containers and scraped their contents into a bowl, then melted 2 tablespoons of fat in a saucepan. Bacon grease if you had it, butter if you didn't, margarine if you were completely out of everything else. 4 tablespoons of gold medal flour went in next, and you stirred until it turned into a roux that smelled nutty and rich and made the kitchen feel warmer than it was, then added 4 cups of milk slowly while whisking so the mixture wouldn't clump and turn into something unusable. The white sauce thickened, and you added a cup of the leftover vegetable pulp, stirring until everything blended smooth and creamy and looked like soup you'd planned instead of soup you'd improvised from scraps nobody wanted. Salt, 3/4 of a teaspoon, because the vegetables were already salted from their first cooking. 1/8 of a teaspoon of pepper, and the soup finished in 10 minutes and went onto the table with saltine. Crackers, because crackers made soup feel like a meal and meals needed substance even when substance was just flour and milk. The 1943 Betty Crocker cookbook called it cream of vegetable soup and said you could use any cooked vegetable you had on hand, which was wartime language for use up your leftovers before they spoil and stop wasting food when soldiers are dying overseas. Your children ate it without enthusiasm because leftover vegetables tasted like leftover vegetables. No matter how much white sauce you poured over them, but they ate it anyway because not eating meant going hungry, and going hungry wasn't an option when food was on the table. Your mother-in-law visited and said cream of vegetable soup was what rich people ate at fancy restaurants downtown. But you knew better because rich people didn't make soup from leftovers, and rich people didn't understand that the best soup came from using what was already cooked and would otherwise turn into compost. 45 cents for milk, flour, fat, and a week's worth of vegetable scraps made enough soup to feed 6 people and taught your children that waste was the enemy and creativity was the solution, and nothing was ever truly useless if you knew what to do with it, and knowing what to do with it was the difference between surviving hard times and surrendering to them. Wednesday morning in 1943, and you opened the jar of dried chipped beef that the grocer sold for 15 cents and had been sitting in the back of the cupboard since last month when your husband's paycheck came through, and you bought extra because you knew there would be weeks when extra meant the difference between eating and not eating. The military men called it SOS, and everyone knew what the letters stood for, but nobody said it out loud in polite company, though your husband said it plenty when he came home from the factory and saw it on the table again, because SOS was what they fed him in the army during the First War, and he said he'd hope never to see it again. You tore the dried beef into strips and dropped them into a pan of boiling water for 2 minutes to draw out some of the salt, because chipped beef was cured so heavily it could last months without refrigeration, but tasted like you were eating the ocean if you didn't rinse it first. While the beef soaked, you made a white sauce with 2 tablespoons of butter melted in a skillet, 2 tablespoons of flour whisked in until it bubbled and turned golden, then 1.5 cups of milk added slowly while you stirred so it wouldn't clump and turn into something you'd have to throw away. And throwing away a white sauce meant wasting butter and flour and milk all at once, which was a sin you couldn't afford to commit when every ingredient counted. The beef came out of the water, and you squeezed it dry with your hands then, dropped it into the white sauce, where it turned the whole thing gray and salty and thick, and you poured it over 4 slices of toasted bread, because toast was the foundation of half the meals you cooked during hard times, and toast never let you down. Your husband ate it without comment because commenting meant complaining, and complaining about food meant you'd forgotten what it was like to be genuinely hungry, and your children ate it because children who refused food didn't get offered food twice, and they learned that lesson early. The military served SOS to millions of soldiers during both wars because it was cheap and filling and could be made in massive quantities with ingredients that didn't spoil. And after the war ended, the soldiers came home and taught their wives how to make it. And SOS became a depression, staple in kitchens across America, even though nobody wanted to admit they were eating the same thing poor soldiers ate in mess halls overseas. 28 cents for chipped beef, butter, flour, milk, and bread fed 4 people, and reminded you that poverty and patriotism tasted exactly the same, and both required you to eat what you were given and be grateful it wasn't worse. Suey Betty Crocker's 1943 wartime cookbook called it American Chop Suey, and placed it in the chapter on stretching meat, which was the polite way of saying how to feed a family when you didn't have enough meat to feed a family, and had to make a half-pound of ground beef look like enough for 6 people. Tuesday evening, and you boiled a half-pound of elbow macaroni in salted water until it turned soft and swollen, drained it, then browned a half-pound of ground beef in a skillet with a diced onion and a chopped green pepper if you had one, which you usually didn't because green peppers were expensive, and expensive meant unnecessary. A can of crushed tomatoes went into the meat, along with salt, pepper, a pinch of sugar to cut the acid that made cheap tomatoes taste metallic, and a shake of chili powder if you were feeling adventurous. Then you stirred the cooked macaroni into the sauce and called it dinner, because dinner was whatever filled the gap between afternoon and bedtime. American chop suey had nothing to do with China and everything to do with using what was in the cupboard when the cupboard was nearly empty. And your children didn't care what it was called as long as it was hot, and there was enough for seconds. Your husband called it goulash, your mother called it slumgullion, your neighbor called it Johnny Marzetti, but the name didn't matter because it all tasted the same. Pasta, ground beef, tomatoes, onions, cooked together in one pot and served in bowls that made it feel like soup, even though it wasn't soup. It was just everything mixed together, because mixing things together was faster than keeping them separate. And faster meant you could get dinner on the table before everyone started complaining. 35 cents for macaroni, ground beef, tomatoes, and an onion made enough to feed 6 people and leave leftovers for tomorrow's lunch, which you packed in tin pails for your children to take to school and your husband to take to the factory, where he worked 10-hour shifts and came home too tired to talk. American chop suey became a school cafeteria staple in the 1950s and 1960s, the kind of thing lunch ladies served on Fridays when the budget was tight and 300 students needed feeding, and by the 1970s people started calling it nostalgic and making it for dinner parties as a joke. But during the war it wasn't nostalgic and it wasn't a joke. The last meal in Betty Crocker's wartime cookbook should have been something triumphant, something that celebrated the end of rationing and the return of abundance. But instead, it was creamed tuna on toast, because creamed tuna was what you ate when nothing else was available, and nothing else was available more often than something was. Wednesday evening in 1945, and you opened a 5-ounce can of chunk light tuna packed in water, drained it over the sink, picked through the flakes for bones, even though canned tuna wasn't supposed to have bones, then made a white sauce by melting 2 tablespoons of butter in a saucepan, whisking in 2 tablespoons of flour until it bubbled, and slowly adding a cup and a half of milk while stirring constantly so it wouldn't clump and ruin everything. The sauce thickened and you added the tuna and a cup of frozen peas and salt and pepper, then poured the mixture over 4 slices of toasted bread, because toast was the answer to every meal you couldn't figure out how to serve any other way. Your mother made creamed tuna during the Depression, when your father was out of work and money ran out halfway through the month, and she called it hard times tuna, because hard times required meals that stretched and filled and cost almost nothing, and creamed tuna did all 3 without pretending to be something it wasn't. Your children ate it without enthusiasm, and your husband ate it without comment, and you ate it because you'd cooked it, and wasting food was a sin that added up when you committed it every day for 6 years straight. 55 cents for canned tuna, butter, flour, milk, peas, and bread fed 4 people, and reminded you that the war was almost over, and once it was over, you'd never have to make creamed tuna again, unless you wanted to, and you were certain you wouldn't want to, because creamed tuna tasted like rationing and sacrifice and making do with what little you had. But you were wrong. You made creamed tuna every month for the next 30 years, not because you had to, but because your children grew up and got married and brought their own children to your table, and asked if you still made that tuna thing from when they were small, and you said yes and made it again, and watched them eat it, and smile and tell their children that this was what their grandmother used to make during the war, and their children wrinkled their noses and said it looked like baby food, but ate it anyway, because family meals weren't about the food. They were about the memory, and the memory of creamed tuna on toast was the memory of a mother who kept a family fed through the hardest years anyone could remember. 30 meals, 6 cents to 55 cents each. Every single one came from Betty Crocker's wartime cookbooks, when America was learning how to eat on nothing and make it last. Half of these ingredients don't exist anymore. Not because they went extinct, but because we stopped saving bacon, grease, and picking dandelion greens and turning stale bread into something worth eating. The women who cooked these meals didn't write food blogs or take pictures for Instagram. They just fed their families when feeding a family was the hardest job in the world, and then they died and took the recipes with them, because nobody thought to ask how they did it until it was too late. Your grandmother made at least 10 of these dishes and never told you because she thought you'd judge her for eating weeds and turning leftovers into breakfast and stretching a pound of ground beef across 3 dinners. She was probably right, but she kept her family alive through the Depression and the war and every hard time in between, and the meals that kept them alive cost less than $1 and tasted like love, even when love was just flour and water and salt. If you made it this far, hit subscribe, because these recipes are disappearing faster than the women who cooked them, and once they're gone, nobody's bringing them back. Drop a comment and tell me which meal your grandmother made and whether you remember how it tasted, because these weren't just meals, they were survival, and survival is worth remembering.